January 1945. The Rhineland lies under a grey winter sky, silent except for the distant rumble of artillery. A thin column of German soldiers moves along a frozen road, their boots sinking into slush, their breath rising in pale clouds. At the front of the line, a young lieutenant studies a map that no longer matters. His unit is supposed to reach the front by nightfall, but their last truck broke down miles behind them. The men carry rifles but little else. Their rations are gone, their fuel drums are empty, their supply trains never arrived. Across the river, on roads the Germans can no longer see, American convoys stretch so far that their engines form one continuous hum. Endless rows of olive-drab trucks roll forward in steady waves, headlights glowing through the mist. Each carries crates of ammunition, food, fuel, winter clothing, spare parts, and medical kits stacked with industrial precision. At every junction, military police guide the flow with a rhythm that feels effortless. The German lieutenant watches the horizon, knowing the imbalance cannot be reversed. Because this was never just a matter of trucks. It was a matter of systems, choices, and scale that shaped the fate of the war. To understand why German commanders could not mirror the American logistical network, it is necessary to step back into the decades before the conflict. The story does not begin on the battlefields of Europe. It begins in factories, rail yards, oil fields, and government offices where nations shaped their industrial identities long before a single shot was fired. In the United States, the early 20th century saw an economic landscape defined by scale. Assembly lines stretched across enormous factory floors. Mass production shaped everything from automobiles to farm machinery. Companies refined processes that favored standardization, interchangeable parts, and continuous output. When the war finally arrived, this foundation allowed the United States to build logistical strength before the first convoy sailed across the Atlantic. The country did not need to reinvent its industrial culture. It only needed to redirect it. Germany, by contrast, approached the war with a far different industrial inheritance. The nation possessed talented engineers, advanced technical innovation, and a strong manufacturing tradition. Yet the system behind those achievements was fragmented. Many firms guarded their own designs. Production lines lacked uniformity. Multiple versions of the same weapon existed at once, each requiring its own parts and tools. The economy had not been prepared for a long war of materials. It had been shaped for short campaigns that relied on speed, shock, and decisive breakthroughs. The difference was also geographic. The United States enjoyed vast natural resources, from oil and steel to food and rubber substitutes. These assets lay within a secure homeland far beyond enemy reach. Germany entered the war with limited access to oil, reduced reserves of critical minerals, and dependence on imported raw materials vulnerable to blockade. From the very beginning, German logistics operated within a shrinking circle of possibility. Leadership philosophies deepened the divide. American military planners believed that war required overwhelming supply. Officers studied flow, distribution, and transport long before units marched into combat. The Army Quartermaster Corps and its related branches trained officers who understood supply as an engineering problem. They viewed logistics not as a background task, but as the backbone of national power. German military culture took a different path. Operational maneuver, battlefield initiative, and decisive offense shaped doctrine. Logistics played a supporting role, not a central pillar. The assumption, rooted in earlier conflicts, was that campaigns would be short and victorious. The army would strike first, win quickly, and finish before material limits could apply pressure. When the war expanded across continents, this assumption crumbled. The early campaigns masked the growing imbalance. Victories in Poland, the Low Countries, and France appeared to validate German strategy. Fast armored thrusts achieved sweeping results. Yet behind the triumphant headlines, the supply system already showed strain. Columns of horse-drawn wagons followed mechanized units because the army still depended on millions of animals for movement. Fuel reserves ran low when advances outpaced railheads. Maintenance units found themselves repairing a diverse fleet of vehicles with mismatched parts. In the United States, the pre-war years built something entirely different. The automotive industry knew how to make vehicles in enormous quantities. American roads and transport companies had already refined systems suited for long-distance distribution. When the government mobilized, it could draw on a culture of mass production unmatched anywhere else. By 1942, factories were shifting from civilian to military output with a momentum that rapidly outgrew every other nation involved in the conflict. The scale of American planning reflected this confidence. The nation prepared not for local battles, but for global operations. It created structures capable of managing shipping, port unloading, inland transport, warehousing, and delivery across entire theaters. The Army Service Forces organized supply as a system, integrating procurement, storage, and distribution into a single coordinated framework. Every truck, every crate, and every gallon of fuel belonged to a sequence of movement that could be measured, predicted, and controlled. Germany's leadership attempted to adapt, but their efforts never matched the scope of the problem. Centralized economic control came too late. Standardization efforts struggled against competing firms and wartime pressure. The air war strained factories faster than they could recover. Rail lines faced constant repair demands. Fuel production fell year after year as fields in Romania came under threat. By the time the conflict reached its middle years, the contrast between the two nations was no longer hidden. It had become structural. The American system developed upward and outward, while the German system stretched, cracked, and struggled to adjust. This widening gap sets the stage for the wartime years that followed, when the demands of global conflict turned these early differences into decisive outcomes. By 1942, the United States had fully shifted from peacetime industry to a war economy. Factories once producing cars, refrigerators, and tractors now churned out tanks, trucks, and artillery. Ships rolled off the ways in staggering numbers. The Quartermaster Corps, Transportation Corps, and Army Service Forces coordinated efforts that integrated production, shipping, and battlefield delivery into a single massive flow. Every crate of ammunition, every gallon of gasoline, every pair of boots was accounted for, tracked, and sent where it was needed. American logistics was no longer reactive, it was proactive, anticipatory, and systemic. Across the Atlantic, German supply chains strained under their own success. Early victories had propelled them far beyond their industrial and transportation capacity. Poland, France, and the Low Countries had been conquered swiftly, but each advance stretched lines of supply dangerously thin. Rail networks, the backbone of German logistics, could not keep pace with mechanized units. Horses and carts carried what fuel and ammunition rail could not reach, but their pace was painfully slow. By 1943, shortages were affecting operational decisions. Fuel rationing determined where panzer divisions could strike. Ammunition limitations curtailed offensives. Even basic rations for infantry were inconsistent, and winter clothing often arrived too late. The contrast became stark in North Africa, and later Italy. American forces demonstrated unprecedented mobility, moving entire divisions with minimal delay. Ports were efficiently unloaded, roads maintained, and truck convoys organized with precision. The Red Ball Express, though improvised, showcased a system capable of moving enormous quantities of fuel and supplies across hundreds of miles under difficult conditions. German forces, by contrast, often relied on captured stockpiles, improvisation, and local resources. When these failed, units stalled or retreated. Geography compounded German difficulties. Rail lines concentrated in certain corridors made supply vulnerable to disruption. Allied bombing increasingly targeted oil fields, rail yards, and production centers. Every Allied raid forced German command to divert resources to repair infrastructure rather than supply frontline troops. Meanwhile, American logistical planning accounted for redundancy. Alternate ports, fuel depots, and truck routes were prepared long before they were needed, keeping the flow steady even under attack. The scale of manpower also mattered. The United States could mobilize millions of men for logistical work: drivers, mechanics, warehouse staff, engineers, and clerks. Every unit had specialists trained in supply management. German manpower was stretched between combat units and support functions, leaving supply chains vulnerable. Even when German commanders recognized the problem, there were few personnel available to implement systemic solutions. Leadership culture shaped priorities. American officers emphasized foresight and preparation. Planning was deliberate, documented, and enforced. German commanders were forced into reactive decisions, improvising solutions in the field that could never achieve systemic efficiency. While the German High Command debated fuel distribution and transport priorities, American logistics simply delivered what was needed when it was needed. By 1944, the logistical gap had become decisive. Normandy and the subsequent European campaigns revealed that victory depended not only on tanks and aircraft, but on the ability to feed, fuel, and move men and material across hundreds of miles. American forces could sustain offensive momentum indefinitely. German forces, despite bravery and tactical skill, could not. Their supply network, constrained by scale, geography, and industrial limitations, failed to support their ambitions. This widening gulf in logistics would shape every battlefield decision for the remainder of the war. Every advance, every counterattack, every defensive maneuver hinged on whether fuel, ammunition, and food could reach the front lines. And in this struggle, the Americans had already built a system their German opponents could never replicate. At the heart of any logistical system are the people who plan, coordinate, and execute its movements. In the United States, this human network was as meticulously designed as the vehicles and warehouses it relied upon. Officers trained in the Quartermaster Corps, Transportation Corps, and Army Service Forces became specialists in anticipating needs. Their workrooms were filled with maps, charts, and spreadsheets long before computers existed. Men and women calculated daily fuel consumption for every division, tracked spare parts for thousands of vehicles, and coordinated port unloading schedules to ensure that trucks never waited for supplies. Discipline, foresight, and institutional memory became as important as horsepower or tonnage. German human networks, in contrast, faced constant fragmentation. Orders often came from multiple commands, each with its own priorities. Staff officers worked under immense pressure, trying to stretch limited manpower and materials to meet ambitious operational plans. Individual skill could compensate for systemic weaknesses only so far. German soldiers often found themselves improvising, carrying their own ammunition when supply lines faltered, scavenging fuel from abandoned depots, or waiting days for food. Leadership in Germany valued initiative and bold tactics, but planning for logistics was considered secondary until shortages became visible at the front. The human factor, then, was not simply about personnel. It was about culture. American logistics emphasized consistency, delegation, and redundancy. German efforts relied on improvisation and heroism under stress. Both produced results in the short term, but over months and years, the difference in human systems became decisive. Technology underpinned every logistical advantage. American trucks, often mass-produced in standard models, could be repaired anywhere, parts were interchangeable, and fuel could be delivered to almost any forward position. Warehouses employed forklifts and mechanized loaders, and rail systems were integrated with road convoys to move massive quantities of material. Communications technology, including telephones and radio networks, allowed commanders to track supply flows in real time, adjusting priorities as the battlefield shifted. German technology, while advanced in weapons systems, did not translate to supply networks. Trucks were fewer in number, maintenance more complicated, and parts often incompatible between models. Reliance on horse-drawn wagons remained widespread even into late 1944. Fuel shortages, vehicle breakdowns, and poorly maintained rail lines created bottlenecks that no tactical brilliance could overcome. German engineers could innovate for weapons or aircraft, but they could not redesign a national logistical culture under the pressure of war. The technological gap was not just mechanical, it was systemic. The Americans applied industrial technology to logistics itself. Germany applied technology to combat arms. One delivered a flow of material that matched strategy. The other delivered impressive weapons that often could not reach the battlefield when needed. The consequences of logistics were never abstract. They manifested directly on the battlefield. American commanders could plan offensives knowing that supply lines would follow. The Normandy breakout in July 1944, depended on fuel and ammunition arriving faster than German forces could react. Entire divisions moved with confidence because trucks and convoys ensured that what was promised in orders would actually arrive. Mobility was sustained, allowing operational tempo to be relentless. German tactics, conversely, were constrained by supply. Panzer divisions capable of rapid thrusts were forced to halt when fuel ran out. Infantry assaults were delayed due to ammunition shortages. Commanders often had to choose between committing units fully and risking their depletion, or holding them in reserve while desperately searching for supplies. Even when tactical brilliance emerged, the lack of logistical support transformed potential victories into temporary gains or stalemates. In short, logistics dictated strategy. For the Americans, it amplified tactical options. For the Germans, it imposed limits. Battles were not only fought with weapons and men, they were fought with the capacity to deliver food, fuel, and ammunition consistently. These three angles reveal the initial layers of why the German logistical effort could not match the Americans. But the picture is not complete without examining the industrial, enemy, and psychological dimensions that compounded the challenge. The German logistical struggle was shaped not only by internal limitations but by the relentless pressure applied by the enemy. American and Allied planners deliberately targeted German supply lines, knowing that disrupting logistics could neutralize superior weapons. Strategic bombing campaigns, submarine warfare, and air interdiction operations destroyed rail hubs, oil refineries, and key depots. Every factory destroyed or rail line disabled forced German commanders to reroute supplies, often through already overburdened corridors. By 1943, fuel shortages were directly linked to these Allied operations, constraining operational decisions at the highest levels. The more the Germans tried to replicate the American system, the more it was obstructed by a calculated and relentless enemy effort. At the same time, American logistics benefited from near immunity to enemy interference. The Atlantic convoys were protected by the Navy and Air Force. Ports could be expanded and secured with minimal threat. Inland transport flowed unimpeded, allowing frontline units to receive a constant stream of supplies. In every theater, the enemy's ability to disrupt American logistics was limited, while German supply chains faced almost constant attrition. This imbalance magnified the systemic gap between the two nations. Industrial capacity defined what each nation could deliver. The United States possessed an industrial machine built for sustained mass production. Factories could produce thousands of trucks, thousands of tons of ammunition, and hundreds of tanks each month. Standardization simplified maintenance, spare parts, and training. Supply chains were designed with redundancy in mind. If one plant faltered, another could fill the gap. This industrial depth was unprecedented and allowed the Americans to operate far beyond the logistical limits of any other nation in the conflict. Germany's industrial system, while advanced, lacked the scale and integration to match. Multiple manufacturers produced overlapping designs, creating maintenance nightmares. Raw materials were scarce and increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing. Fuel production and distribution could not meet the demands of mechanized warfare. Even when new vehicles or weapons were deployed, their impact was often delayed or reduced by insufficient supplies. German industry had brilliance, but not breadth. They could produce remarkable weapons, yet the volume and systemic support required to sustain a modern army across multiple fronts exceeded their capabilities. The human toll of logistics was as much psychological as practical. German soldiers endured chronic shortages. Food, ammunition, and winter clothing were inconsistent, sometimes non-existent. Fatigue, frustration, and the sense of abandonment affected morale. Field commanders, unable to provide adequate support, faced impossible decisions daily. Courage and initiative could not compensate for material deficiencies. Units became hesitant, defensive, and reactive, anticipating shortages before orders arrived. In contrast, American forces experienced the confidence that comes from reliable supply. Food, fuel, medical care, and equipment arrived predictably. Soldiers could trust that reinforcements and resupply would reach them. This consistency reinforced morale, allowing commanders to execute bold, coordinated operations without fearing that men would stall due to lack of support. In combat, The psychological advantage of abundance was decisive. Soldiers fight better when they are fed, armed and clothed. They plan aggressively when they trust the logistics behind them. Across these angles, the structural, technological, human and psychological forces converged. They reveal that the inability of German commanders to replicate the American logistics network was not a single failure, but a series of compounded constraints. These constraints would define the critical battles to come, where supply determined the fate of entire divisions. Summer 1944 marked a turning point on the Western Front. The Allies had landed in Normandy on June 6, a meticulously planned operation that depended not only on combat power, but on the capacity to sustain it. Behind the front lines, American supply officers orchestrated a massive network. Fuel, ammunition, rations and spare parts flowed steadily from British ports into France. Every truck, every train and every warehouse was a link in a chain that stretched hundreds of miles, ready to support the advancing armies. German commanders watched in disbelief. The operational doctrine that had once allowed rapid armored thrusts was constrained by depleted fuel stocks and fragmented rail networks. Panzer divisions poised for counterattacks were halted because tanks had no fuel, artillery lacked shells, and infantry waited days for basic rations. Every plan had to account for what supplies were physically available, not what strategy demanded. The Red Bull Express became the emblem of this contrast. Established in August 1944, it was an improvised convoy system designed to move fuel and ammunition to fast-moving frontline units. Thousands of American trucks, driven by young soldiers and supported by meticulous dispatching and maintenance, traversed hundreds of miles under dangerous conditions. Roads were filled with a constant flow of convoys, headlights forming a continuous ribbon across the French countryside. Supplies that would have stalled German advances arrived without delay for the Allies, enabling sustained operational tempo. At the same time, German attempts to respond were piecemeal and desperate. Orders from Hitler and his generals often conflicted. Fuel stockpiles were redirected between units, only to be intercepted or consumed before reaching intended destinations. Rail lines were bombed or clogged, while horse-drawn wagons struggled to bridge gaps. German officers recorded mounting frustration. Decisions were tactical but constrained by logistical impossibility. No matter the ingenuity of commanders, the system could not deliver enough material to match the Allied flow. The consequences were immediate on the battlefield. During Operation Cobra in late July, the American breakout depended on mobility and continuous resupply. Allied armored units surged forward, exploiting gaps in German lines. German defenses, lacking ammunition and fuel, collapsed under sustained pressure, where German tanks could have counterattacked. They sat idle, engines cold, crews waiting. Infantry, exhausted and underfed, could not hold defensive positions effectively. Each kilometer gained by American forces was a testament to logistical mastery, each stalled German response a sign of systemic collapse. By August, the gap was undeniable. The Allies pushed toward Paris and beyond, their supply lines flexible and resilient. German units faced exhaustion, attrition, and fragmentation. Commanders realized that no single tactical maneuver could compensate for deficiencies in transport, fuel, and ammunition. The war's momentum had shifted irreversibly, driven as much by logistical capacity as by guns or tanks. This breaking point would set the stage for the final phase of the conflict, where German attempts to regain the initiative would collide with an American system that could sustain continuous, overwhelming pressure. As autumn approached in 1944, German forces faced a stark reality. The logistical imbalance was no longer temporary, it was permanent. The Ardennes offensive, launched in December, was conceived as a last gamble. Hitler's plan depended on surprise, speed, and the ability to seize Allied fuel depots. Yet from the outset, logistical constraints undermined every aspect of the operation. Panzer divisions advanced rapidly in places, but fuel shortages forced units to halt short of objectives. Tanks were abandoned along the forest roads, engines cold, crews walking back through the snow. Ammunition ran out as German artillery tried to sustain pressure on entrenched American positions. American logistics, by contrast, maintained flexibility even under extreme conditions. Truck convoys bypassed bombed roads. Alternate routes were used without disruption. Forward supply depots kept advancing units stocked with fuel, food, and medical care. When the weather turned bitter, the Red Ball Express and other convoy networks ensured that mobility did not falter. Where German tanks stalled for lack of fuel, American forces moved unimpeded, their operations synchronized with supply in a way that German command could never replicate. Even German leadership recognized the gap. Field Marshal Model and other senior officers repeatedly warned that the offensive was overextended, that supplies would not support sustained operations. Speer, in his post-war memoirs, emphasized the impossibility of creating a transport system capable of matching the Americans. Every attempt to concentrate resources failed. The system itself could not generate the necessary throughput. Orders to redirect fuel or munitions often collided with reality. Nothing remained in the depots to send. On the battlefield, the consequences were immediate and stark. In the Ardennes, German panzer units initially penetrated American lines, but their advance slowed and eventually stalled. The lack of fuel and ammunition prevented exploitation of breakthroughs. American forces, sustained by robust supply networks, could regroup, counterattack, and push the Germans back. Roads once choked with frozen and abandoned vehicles became symbols of systemic failure. The operational limitations imposed by logistics proved decisive. German commanders had the tactics and intent, but not the means to sustain them. Across Europe, similar patterns emerged. As the Allies pushed toward Germany in early 1945, every German countermeasure faced the same obstacle. Shortages dictated strategy, limited options, and forced improvisation. Where the Americans advanced, fuel and supplies followed. Where the Germans retreated, they did so with dwindling provisions, often abandoning equipment and lives in the process. Every strategic decision, from Normandy to the Siegfried Line, reflected the underlying truth: logistics had become the deciding factor in modern warfare. By the close of 1944, the logistical gap was irreversible. German commanders understood that no organizational reform, no last-minute invention, no audacious plan could reproduce the scale, coordination, and reliability of the American system. Battles were no longer merely tactical contests. They were demonstrations of industrial power, planning, and the ability to sustain human effort over hundreds of miles. The war's outcome, long uncertain, had already been determined by the capacity to feed, fuel, and move men and material across the European theater. This recognition sets the stage for the aftermath, where the consequences of this unbridgeable gap would play out in the final campaigns of the war. The months following the Ardennes offensive revealed the full weight of the logistical disparity. German armies were fragmented, undersupplied, and increasingly unable to execute even basic operational tasks. Fuel shortages halted armored units, rail networks collapsed under Allied bombing, horse-drawn wagons could not bridge the growing gaps. By early 1945, German commanders faced a brutal reality. Supply failures now dictated the rhythm of combat. They could no longer choose the timing of attacks or retreats. Their strategy was bound by what could physically be delivered. American forces exploited this advantage relentlessly. Supply chains remained intact even as front lines advanced hundreds of miles. Ports were efficiently captured, unloaded, and integrated into the network. Trucks carried ammunition, fuel, and rations directly to units, allowing operational tempo to remain high. Medical support and repair units kept the fighting forces resilient. Every engagement was underpinned by a certainty: resources would be there when needed. The structural consequences for Germany were immediate. Front-line units began abandoning equipment when fuel or ammunition ran out. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective, not by enemy fire, but by supply collapse. Communication lines became fragmented. Command decisions were limited to what could be physically moved. Even elite formations, capable of exceptional tactical performance, could not overcome systemic failure. Operational planning shifted from aggression to survival, from maneuver to mere maintenance of positions. The psychological impact compounded the material problem. Soldiers recognized that even successful attacks could not be sustained. High command staff recorded growing frustration, knowing that clever plans were often undone by shortages. Logistics dictated tempo. and the Germans found themselves permanently on the defensive, forced to improvise rather than execute coherent strategy. Meanwhile, the Allies maintained offensive momentum. Every kilometer gained by American forces represented not just tactical success, but the confirmation of a system designed to deliver victory through supply as much as firepower. As winter turned into spring of 1945, German forces retreated along increasingly narrow corridors, their capacity to resist steadily diminishing. Rail hubs, refineries, and warehouses had been destroyed or captured, leaving few alternatives. Fuel distribution collapsed, forcing the abandonment of tanks and trucks, further reducing mobility. Food and ammunition were scarce, undermining morale and combat effectiveness. The structural consequences were clear. The Germans could no longer fight as a cohesive, mobile force. The war's end became a logistical inevitability, driven less by battlefield tactics than by systemic incapacity. After the war, historians and military leaders alike recognized the decisive role logistics played in shaping outcomes. German commanders, including Field Marshal Model and Albert Speer, repeatedly emphasized that the inability to sustain forces over long distances was as critical as losses in men and equipment. In post-war memoirs, Speer highlighted that Germany's industrial system was never designed for the scale required by modern multi-front warfare. No amount of tactical ingenuity or battlefield heroism could compensate for shortages of fuel, vehicles, and ammunition. The German military faced the stark truth: logistics had become the ultimate arbiter of success and failure. Allied assessments confirmed this reality. The US Army noted that their logistical network had allowed them to maintain operational tempo in a way German forces simply could not match. Ports, depots, and road networks provided a constant stream of supplies, while tracking and redundancy ensured minimal disruption. The Red Ball Express and other convoy systems exemplified how speed, coordination, and scale could be leveraged to decisive advantage. Analysts concluded that American logistical superiority was a force multiplier. It magnified combat effectiveness, enabled sustained offensives, and constrained enemy options. The industrial gap reinforced these conclusions. Post-war studies examined production figures. The United States produced tens of thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of fuel, and unparalleled quantities of ammunition and equipment, far exceeding Germany's capacity. Standardization allowed rapid repairs and streamlined resupply, while German diversity in models and reliance on limited raw materials created bottlenecks. Even when German innovation produced technologically advanced weapons, they often arrived too late, in too few numbers, or without the fuel and ammunition necessary to make a difference. Strategic thinkers drew broader lessons. Logistics was no longer a secondary consideration. It was central to modern warfare. Supply networks determined what could be attempted, where and for how long. The war demonstrated that operational brilliance was insufficient if it was not backed by reliable, large-scale material support. Germany's failures in sustaining its forces underscored the interdependence of planning, industry, and human resources. In the final months of the war, German forces collapsed under pressure that was as much structural as tactical. Supply lines failed, units disintegrated, and defensive positions became untenable. By the time Allied troops crossed into central Germany, German command knew that no counter-offensive could be supported. The system itself had failed, and with it, the ability to wage war effectively. The post-war analysis leaves a clear conclusion. The American logistical network was not simply an advantage, it was the backbone of victory. German commanders, despite courage, tactical skill, and technological innovation, could not replicate the scale, coordination, and reliability of the system that sustained the Allies across the European theatre. Logistics had determined the outcome long before the final shots were fired. War is often measured in battles, heroism, and firepower. Yet in the quiet corridors of warehouses, along endless convoys, and within the hum of engines lies the true measure of military strength. The story of the American logistical network is a testament to foresight, planning, and industrial might. It shows how a nation's ability to feed, fuel, and move its forces can become the decisive factor in modern conflict. For German commanders, the lesson was painfully clear. Tactical brilliance, armored thrusts, and innovative weapons could not overcome systemic limitations. Decisions made decades before the war about industry, standardization, and transport infrastructure manifested in every stalled offensive, every abandoned vehicle, every rationless night on the front. The gap between American abundance and German scarcity was not merely operational, it was structural, cultural, and psychological. The human dimension is equally striking. Soldiers on both sides experienced the tangible effects of logistics, confidence or despair, momentum or paralysis. Where Americans advanced, secure in the knowledge that supply would follow, Germans hesitated or improvised, constrained by scarcity. The war's outcome was shaped as much by the reliability of trucks and warehouses as by guns and tanks. Ultimately, this event reshaped military thinking for generations. Logistics became central to doctrine, strategy, and planning. Modern armies study supply chains, redundancy, and throughput, not as an afterthought, but as a core determinant of operational capability. The lessons of 1944 and 45 remain enduring. The ability to sustain forces across space and time is the foundation upon which victory is built. In reflecting on this, one sees the quiet power of systems over individual heroism, of preparation over improvisation, and of scale over ingenuity. The American logistical network did not merely support the war effort, it defined it, enabling forces to strike with decisiveness, resilience, and continuity. German commanders could not replicate it, and in that failure, the fate of Europe was sealed. The war teaches that in modern conflict, victory is as much about moving what you have as it is about fighting with it. And in the winter of 1944, on roads stretching across France and Germany, that lesson was written in every mile of convoy, every stocked warehouse, and every empty fuel drum.